The morning Vera and Roy Calloway drove away from the Holt farm for the last time, the dogwoods along the creek road were just beginning to open. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. White blossoms against an April sky the color of old pewter, the kind of cold spring morning that smells of mud and new growth and mountain air that has come down overnight and not yet warmed. Vera watched the trees through the passenger window as Roy drove, not turning when they reached the county road, just watching the dogwoods pass one after another until they were gone, and there was only the road ahead and the sound of buttons shifting in his carrier on the back seat. 35 years she had watched those dogwoods bloom from the porch of the house she had just left. She did not look back. Some things you carry forward or you do not carry at all, and Vera Calloway had made her decision about which kind of woman she intended to be some time before this particular morning. Roy drove the way he always drove when something was working through him. Both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, not speaking. He was 73 years old and had spent 32 of those years as a licensed electrician across 3 counties of eastern Tennessee, and the work had built into him a particular habit of physical steadiness that never fully left him, even now, even retired. Even with the bad knee that had been replaced twice and still announced itself in cold weather with a dull insistence, he managed by not discussing it. His hair had gone white in his 60s, and he had let it go without comment. He was not a man who spent time thinking about how he appeared. Vera knew this about him the way she knew most things about Roy Calloway after 41 years of marriage, not because he had told her, but because she had watched him long enough to understand the patterns underneath his habits. When something troubled him, he drove, or he worked with his hands, or he did both at once if the situation permitted. When the settlement news had come through Carl Webb's office 6 weeks ago, Roy had spent 4 days rewiring the kitchen of their rental apartment without anyone asking him to. The kitchen had not needed rewiring. It had simply needed something to do with his hands. Vera was 71. She had kept books for 26 years at a hardware supply business in Keller's Fork, the kind of small family operation that ran on handshakes and careful paper records until the 3rd generation sold it to a chain distributor, and the chain distributor moved all the accounting work to an office in Nashville and thanked Vera for her service with a card signed by people whose names she did not recognize. She had brought the same precision she gave the books to every other part of her life. She balanced her personal accounts to the penny. She kept a running household log in a spiral notebook. She could tell you without looking what she had paid for a box of oatmeal 3 months ago and whether the price had gone up since. She was also, as the people who knew her well understood, considerably more than her careful exterior suggested. Her daughter-in-law had once called her still water, meaning it as a compliment, and Vera had accepted it as one. In the box between her feet on the passenger floor, her mother's recipe cards in their faded tin box. A photograph of her parents taken in 1971, her father standing on the porch of the farmhouse she had just left with his thumbs in his belt loops and the look of a man who knows exactly where he stands. 3 of her 4 journals from across the years of the farm. A small bundle of letters her father had sent her mother in 1962 when he had worked away for a season. A photograph of Roy at 31, holding up a walleye from the creek with the expression of someone who does not fish often enough to be dignified about it when things go well. The 4th journal she had accidentally left in the nightstand drawer and had decided, in the end, not to go back for. She had thought about what she would have written in it anyway. Nothing that needed saving. In the back seat, a gray-muzzled tabby cat named Button slept in a carrier lined with an old flannel shirt. He was 11 years old and had spent every one of those years on the Holt farm, and whatever he understood about the morning's events, he had made no comment about it and seemed inclined to continue in this direction. The Holt family had farmed that stretch of eastern Tennessee hill country since 1889, when Vera's great-grandfather, Elias Holt, had cleared the first 30 acres with a mule team and a conviction built from having already survived more than most men were asked to. He had cut the farmhouse timber from trees on the property and built the house with 2 neighbors across one long summer and had never once considered that it might not stand. It had stood. It had stood when Vera's grandfather raised a family in it through the Depression. It had stood when her father took it over in the late 1950s and added a new wing on the east side. By the time James Holt died, the property had grown to 180 acres and the farmhouse had been expanded twice, and the Holts were known in Keller's Fork as people who worked their land, kept their word, and asked very little of anyone they had not already earned. James Holt died 4 years ago at 89, in the bedroom he had been born in. His wife Ruth followed him 14 months later, which people in Keller's Fork said was not surprising because some couples were like that. James and Ruth Holt had always been like that. The will divided the property equally between James's 2 daughters. Vera, the elder, had been living on the farm for 35 years by the time her father died, had managed the land alongside Roy through all of that time, had overseen the cattle and the hay and the equipment and the accumulation of small improvements that kept a working farm alive across 4 decades. Margaret, the younger daughter, had left Keller's Fork at 23 and had not returned except for holidays and funerals. She had married a property developer from Knoxville named Dennis Strickland and had lived in a gated community outside the city for 30 years, taking her share of the farm's annual income without comment, which had suited everyone well enough. Equal shares had been James's intention, clearly and plainly stated. Vera had read the will herself in the county clerk's office the week after probate closed and had thought, "This is fair." She had believed that for approximately 8 months. What Dennis Strickland found, working with an estate attorney from Knoxville whose firm specialized in what its website called complex rural asset structuring, was a document from 1983. A loan guarantee arrangement that James Holt had signed in connection with a piece of farm equipment, a baler that had cost more than James had on hand at the time, in which Dennis had co-signed as financial guarantor. The document, drafted by a local attorney who had since retired to Florida, contained language that Dennis's Knoxville attorney now argued created a de facto co-trustee arrangement over the property used as loan security. The loan had been paid off in full in 1986. The equipment had been replaced twice since. The document had sat in James Holt's files, forgotten by everyone except the man who had been quietly waiting for the right moment to remember it, for 37 years. The legal proceedings ran 22 months. Vera and Roy retained a local attorney named Carl Webb who was competent and sincere and who told them in the 2nd month that the argument Dennis was making was thin, and in the 8th month that thin arguments pressed by expensive attorneys become expensive problems regardless of their merits, and in the 14th month that they needed to think carefully about how far they could afford to continue. They had spent $47,000 in legal fees. They had sold the cattle to cover it. They had depleted 11 years of retirement savings, the ones they had built with care across all the years of the farm, and watched them go in increments to people who had no interest in the land itself. Margaret had visited the farm once during the proceedings, in the 9th month, and had sat at Vera's kitchen table with a cup of tea and explained, in the measured tone of someone who has rehearsed something until it sounds natural, that this had never been about what any individual wanted, only about protecting the family's financial legacy in a responsible way, and that she genuinely hoped Vera understood that. Vera had said she appreciated her sister making the drive. She had not said anything else, because what she could have said did not belong in that kitchen at that table, and Vera had learned a long time ago that the words you hold back in difficult moments are usually the ones you do not regret. The mediated settlement gave Margaret and Dennis operational and legal control of 178 acres, including the farmhouse and all outbuildings, the equipment barn, and the water rights along the creek road. Vera and Roy received $8,200, the remainder of the settlement after legal fees, and one additional asset that Dennis's team had not bothered to claim: a rusted tin shed on the far eastern corner of the property. 400 square feet of corrugated metal sheeting on a concrete slab, sitting on a quarter-acre of ground at the base of a low hill, surrounded by 20 years of unchecked blackberry and wild rose growth. The shed had last been actively used sometime in the early 1970s. The county assessor's report, included in the settlement documents presumably to demonstrate that the concession was genuine, described the structure as having no identifiable market value and noted that demolition costs would likely exceed any proceeds from the sale of the land given the quarter-acre's limited road access. Dennis's attorney had delivered the paperwork with the smooth efficiency of someone who sees nothing in it worth examining closely. The call from Margaret came that same evening. It lasted for minutes. She said she hoped Vera understood that this had been about protecting what their father had worked for, and that she truly hoped there were no hard feelings between them. Vera said she appreciated the call. She did not say anything else. Word moved through Keller's Fork within a week, as it always did, with the thorough efficiency of a community where everyone's circumstances are considered worth tracking by the people who care about them. Patty Osgood from the next farm over brought a casserole without calling ahead and left it on the apartment doorstep. Earl Hicks, who ran the feed supply on the edge of town and had known Roy since they were both 20 years old, shook Roy's hand with both of his when Roy came in for some hardware and said it was a sorry business, and he was sorry, which was about as much sentiment as Earl Hicks had in him, and which Roy received as the genuine thing it was. What was harder to absorb than the sympathy was the doubt. The kind, well-meaning doubt of people who loved them and could not, in good conscience, watch without saying something. Patty mentioned, not for the first time, that Vera's son in Chattanooga had a finished basement sitting empty and that nobody would think less of them for taking it while they sorted things out. A woman from their church had brought up the senior housing complex on Route 11 twice, mentioning that her cousin worked in the office and could perhaps help move things along. Vera thanked everyone. She said she appreciated their concern. She did not mention to any of them what she and Roy had actually decided. Roy had raised it over dinner in the third week of the apartment, setting his fork down with the deliberateness of a man who has been waiting until the right moment. He said he thought they should move into the shed and fix it up. He said he knew how it sounded. Vera had looked at him across the small kitchen table, at the man she had been married to for 41 years, and she had thought about what she knew of him and what she knew of herself and what they had, between them, already built from nothing more than work and time and the decision to show up again the next day. She had thought about the apartment at $680 a month. She had thought about the savings account and the list she had made of what it needed to cover, and how the list was longer than the amount by a margin that was not comfortable. She had thought about Roy's face in February when he had crouched at the north wall of the shed and pressed his palm against the corrugated metal and gone very still. "All right," she had said, "but we fixed the roof first." They drove out to the eastern corner of the old property that same week to look at the structure again with a changed purpose. Roy walked around it twice in the cold air, stopping at each corner, pressing his hand flat against the metal sheeting in several places, crouching slowly and with some difficulty at the base of the north wall to examine where the sheeting met the ground. He was not a man who dramatized his thinking. He simply looked and let the looking do what it needed to do. On the second circuit, at the north wall, he straightened up and turned to Vera and said, "I want to get inside." It took 3 more weeks to arrange things. The apartment lease ran through the end of the month. There were tools to gather and materials to source on a budget that did not allow for errors, logistics to work through with the particular care of 2 people who know exactly what they have and exactly what it needs to do. Roy made a list of what the shed required. Vera reviewed it and made a second list. They combined the 2 lists and crossed off everything that could wait. On the first Tuesday of March, they loaded what remained of their belongings into the truck, 3 boxes, 2 bags, Button in his carrier, and drove to the eastern corner of the old Holt property. They were, in the technical and very specific sense of the word, home. The shed door had seized so completely in its track that Roy spent the better part of the morning working it free. He applied penetrating oil in stages, worked the track by degrees, tapped at specific points along the frame rather than forcing the panel itself. He had spent 32 years dealing with components that were reluctant to cooperate and had learned that they yielded to method rather than force, that patience delivered more than pressure, that the right approach applied at the right point was worth more than 10 times the effort applied wrong. Button watched from his carrier with the reserved alarm of a cat that has not yet decided whether this situation merits full concern. When the door finally gave, it moved all at once. A grinding protest that raised a cloud of rust flakes and settled across everything within 6 feet. Roy hung a work light from a hook welded to one of the roof supports and plugged it into the extension cord from the truck. And in the white light, the interior of the shed became visible for the first time in a great many years. The south half was as expected. A concrete floor, cracked along lines that told the story of 30-odd winters of freeze and thaw. Old feed sacks collapsed into themselves in one corner. A rusted barrel without a lid. 3 wooden pallets against the east wall, swollen and half-rotted. A coil of wire too far gone to identify. The accumulated residue of a space used for practical purposes until the practical purposes ended, and then left. The north half was different. From the outside, the north wall appeared to be corrugated metal sheeting, identical to the other 3 walls. From inside, in the work light, It was immediately apparent that it was not. The sheeting had been applied as an exterior skin over a wall of fitted stone dry-laid limestone blocks, large, each one carefully dressed on its face and fitted to its neighbor with a precision and deliberateness that had nothing in common with the shed's simple construction. The stones were pale, almost cream in the artificial light, and the faces were flat, and even in a way that spoke of skilled selection rather than convenience. Roy set his hand flat against the stone. He did not speak for a moment. Then he crouched, slowly, one hand on his knee for support, and looked at where the concrete slab met the base of the stone wall. The joint was clear in the light, a distinct line where the poured concrete ended and the material beneath the stone wall began. Inside the line of the stone, the floor was not concrete. It was packed earth, dark and dense, the particular compacted quality of ground that has not been touched in a very long time. He stayed crouched for a moment longer. Then he straightened and turned to look at Vera with an expression she did not often see on him, the look of a man who has found what he came looking for and understands that finding it is only the beginning. "This is a springhouse," he said. "That stone wall is the east face of a springhouse. We're not standing in a shed that was built on a slab." He pressed his palm against the stone again, flat and steady. "We're standing in a shed that was built around something that was already here, something considerably older." Vera stepped forward and put her own hand on the wall beside his. The stone was cool and faintly damp in the way of old limestone that sits close to groundwater. She looked at the fitted blocks, at the careful, unhurried work of hands that had been gone for more than a century, and she thought about the county assessor's report with its confident, in curious language, corrugated metal structure, concrete slab, no identifiable market value. And she thought about how little a person sees when they are looking for what they expect to find rather than what is actually there. "How old?" she said. Roy considered the stonework. "Pre-Civil War, most likely. This style of construction, fitted limestone dry-laid at this scale, that puts it mid to late 1800s at the earliest estimate. Could be earlier." He looked up at the corrugated metal above them. "Somebody built this shed over the top of it, probably in the 50s or 60s. Wrapped it in tin, poured a concrete slab over the front half, and called it a shed." He shook his head slowly. Either they didn't know what they were covering, or they knew exactly and wanted it out of sight. Vera looked at the north wall. She looked at the way the interior of the structure divided itself so clearly into two separate histories: the cheap, expedient metal construction of the mid-20th century layered over the older, more careful thing beneath it. She thought about the fact that this quarter-acre had been in her family's possession for 130 years. She thought about what it meant that in all that time, no one had apparently asked the question Roy had asked on his second walk around the perimeter. "What is this wall actually made of?" "We need to get inside it," she said. Roy looked at her. He was already thinking about how, that first night, they slept in sleeping bags on the concrete floor of the south half of the shed, which was not comfortable by any measure either of them cared to apply to the word, and which neither of them said a word about. Roy had brought a small camp stove, and Vera made coffee on it in the early dark, and they sat in their sleeping bags with the cups warm in their hands, and the work light casting its white circle across the stone wall, and the night was very quiet around them except for the sound of the creek, which ran somewhere close on the other side of the hill, and whose sound came through the stone, faint and steady. Button had emerged from his carrier after some deliberation and installed himself on the edge of Roy's sleeping bag with the resigned authority of a cat that has decided that if this is where they are, he will proceed to make the best of it. Roy looked at the stone wall for a long time after Vera had fallen asleep. He was thinking about springhouses, about what he knew of them from the years of working in old structures across the county. They were built over springs or over the cold flow of groundwater, the stone walls and the earth insulating the interior, keeping temperatures cool and steady through the summer for the storage of dairy and meat and other perishables. They were practical structures, built for a specific purpose, and when that purpose was replaced by refrigeration and modern storage, most of them had been either demolished or, in cases where they sat on property that was still in use, simply absorbed into the landscape covered over, built around, gradually forgotten by everyone except the ground they sat on. This one had been covered over deliberately, the tin sheeting applied with the specific intention of concealing rather than simply enclosing. Roy had noted the way the sheeting had been fastened at the base, angled slightly inward at the north wall rather than flush against it. leaving a small gap at the bottom. The gap he had first noticed in February that suggested whoever had done the work had either been in a hurry or had not entirely known what they were doing. The result was a structure that concealed the Springhouse without quite successfully erasing the evidence of its existence for anyone who happened to press a palm against the right wall. Vera was 67 when she had learned to keep books. She had thought, at the time, that it was too late to learn something new, and the bookkeeper who trained her had said, without sentimentality, that the only people who thought it was too late to learn something were the ones who had not yet started. She had thought about that a fair amount in the 6 weeks since the settlement. She was thinking about it now, lying in the dark with the sound of the creek coming through the stone, in a rusted shed on a quarter-acre of ground that everyone in Keller's Fork considered worthless, considering what she and Roy had just found. The most overlooked things, in her experience as a bookkeeper, were the ones that had been filed incorrectly, placed in the wrong category, given the wrong label, and then left there undisturbed for so long that the incorrect label started to feel like the truth. The correction, when it finally came, was not dramatic. It was simply a matter of looking at what was actually there rather than what you had been told to expect. She looked at the stone wall and the last of the work light before she closed her eyes. The creek ran on the other side of it, steady and quiet, and the night was very still, and Roy slept beside her with his characteristic solidity, and Button purred at the end of the sleeping bag. And somewhere on the other side of 130 years of unasked questions, the Springhouse held its cold, patient darkness and waited to be found. In the morning, Roy began to plan. The first order of business, before anything else, was making the shed survivable. Howard had approached it the way he approached every structural problem in his 40-year career. Start with what holds the building up, work outward from there, and do not commit to any finish work until you understand what you are finishing over. He had walked every inch of the perimeter twice before touching anything inside. He tested the base of the corrugated walls with the flat of his hand, pressing at intervals, listening for the hollow resonance of metal that had lost its backing. He tested the roof supports 6 steel I-beams running the length of the building by standing beneath each one and pressing upward with a long pole he had brought for the purpose. None of them shifted. The sag at the northern end of the roof, which looked alarming from outside, turned out on inspection to be a drainage issue. Years of leaves and debris accumulating in the gutter trough had held moisture against the end wall, bending the top few feet of metal without compromising the structural frame behind it. A manageable problem, not the one that needed solving first. Water was the first problem. The parcel had no utilities, which they had known from the listing, but the topographic notes Howard had pulled from the county drainage records had shown a spring source somewhere on or near the eastern edge of the property. He found it on the second morning, 20 feet past the eastern wall of the shed in a stand of tulip poplars, a small, clear spring emerging from a limestone fissure at ground level, pooling in a natural stone basin before draining south toward the county forest land. The water ran cold and tasted clean. He arranged with a neighbor 2 miles down the county road for a temporary water haul while they worked out a gravity feed from the spring, and by the end of the first week, they had a functioning, if basic, water supply. Heat was the second problem. The original limestone walls inside the shed were thick 20 inches through the south and east sides, and limestone holds temperature the way clay holds water, slowly, with long retention. But 20 inches of stone is not insulation, and the metal walls of the shed offered nothing in the way of thermal mass. Howard built a firebox from firebricks he purchased from the salvage yard in Middlesboro, set on the limestone flagstone floor at the center of the building, with a single-wall stovepipe routed through a hole he cut in the corrugated roof with a sawzall. The firebox was not elegant. It did the job. Fig adapted to the shed with the pragmatic flexibility of a cat who has learned, across 11 years of living with humans, that comfort is wherever he decides it is. He chose a spot on the south wall, the limestone side, warm from the absorbed heat of the firebox, and installed himself there with the settled permanence of a decision that would not be revisited. They slept on camping cots for the first 2 weeks, in sleeping bags rated to 15 degrees, until Howard built 2 simple bed frames from the lumber he had salvaged from the collapsed section of a neighboring barn whose owner had offered it in exchange for help clearing the site. The frames were solid and plain, the joints made with the quiet competence of a man who had spent 40 years understanding how things were put together. Edna put her mother's quilt on hers. The shed was not comfortable. It was watertight, warm enough, and theirs. It was enough. Carl drove out on the third weekend to check on them, arrived with a cooler full of food his wife had prepared, and stood in the doorway of the shed for a long moment looking at what his brother had made of the space. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Howard, you built a house." "I built a room," Howard said. Carl looked at the firebox and the flagstone floor and the two solid bed frames and the shelf Howard had mounted along the east wall for their books and kitchen supplies, and he said, "Close enough." He helped Howard cut a simple window opening in the south wall, removing a 3-foot section of corrugated metal and installing a salvage window Edna had found at the Middlesbrough architectural surplus for $32, and when the natural light fell across the limestone floor for the first time, Edna stood in the middle of the room and looked at it for a long moment. The herringbone pattern in the old stone was visible now in that light. The angled flags caught the sun differently from their neighbors, making the pattern move slightly as the light shifted, as though the floor were breathing. "Someone laid this with care," she said. Howard was studying the sealed section at the western end of the south wall, his reading glasses on, a small flashlight in his left hand. He had been returning to it at intervals across the first 3 weeks, spending 10 or 15 minutes at a time, never rushing it, working the way he always worked, methodically, without forcing conclusions before the evidence was ready. "The stone in this section," he said, without turning around, "is from a different quarry than the rest of the wall." Edna crossed to stand behind him. He moved the flashlight slowly across the face of the blocked section, and she saw what he meant, not the color difference she had noticed when her hands were on the stone, but something more structural. The blocks in this section were slightly more uniform in size, their faces more precisely dressed, the overall coursing more regular. Whoever had done this work had done it with more care than the surrounding original construction, or with better tools, or both. "When?" she asked. "The mortar chemistry I can't determine without testing, but the tooling marks on the stone faces are consistent with late 1890s or early 1900s work." He moved the flashlight to the bottom course, where the sealed section met the flagstone floor. "And look here." She crouched beside him. The bottom course of the sealed section was bedded differently from the stone above it, not mortared into the existing floor, but set on a thin course of lime plaster that had been applied over the existing flagstone. Someone had been careful not to disturb the original floor when they sealed this section. They had built the wall on top of it rather than anchoring it into it. "That's not a structural repair," Howard said. "No," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Someone built this wall to come down again. They found the key 4 days later." Howard was working on the northwest corner, the patched section where the lighter gauge metal had been applied over the original wall. He had removed the outer sheet to assess the stone beneath, and in the gap between the original limestone and the metal cladding a space of about 2 inches, filled with decades of leaf debris and insect casings and the desiccated remains of one very old mouse nest, he found it. An iron key, approximately 4 inches long, the bow end formed in a simple loop, the bit end cut in a pattern he did not recognize immediately. It was not rusted through. The iron was dark with age and oxide, but structurally sound, the kind of metal that had been properly made and simply left in a dry space for a very long time. He carried it to the firebox light and held it carefully. The bit pattern was consistent with warded lock mechanisms from the late 19th or very early 20th century style that had been largely replaced by pin tumbler locks by the 1920s. Howard had repaired enough old cabinet hardware and barn door hardware across his surveying career to recognize the era. He could not say whether this key matched the sealed section without a lock to test it against, and the sealed section had no visible lock, only mortared stone. But a key hidden in the wall of a building, close to a sealed section, did not require a complex explanation. Edna held it in her palm for a while. The iron was warm from Howard's hand, heavier than it looked. "Someone came back for this and couldn't find it," she said. "Or couldn't come back at all," Howard said. She set it on the shelf beside her mother's Bible and the photograph of her father, and the next morning she drove 26 miles to the Harlan County Public Library and asked the archivist in the local history room for everything they had on the land history of the eastern portion of the county, with particular attention to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Harlan County Local History Collection occupied 2 rooms on the library's 2nd floor, maintained by a woman named Ruth and Combs, who had been the county archivist for 27 years and who received Edna's request with the focused interest of someone in an underfunded department who does not often encounter patrons who know exactly what they are looking for. Ruth pulled the deed books. She pulled the tax ledgers. She pulled the plat maps from the 1880s and 1890s and spread them on the light table with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times and understands that the faster you put the primary source in front of the researcher, the faster you find out whether they are going to need your help or not. Edna needed her help. The plat maps for the Eastern County showed the parcel, her parcel, tax parcel 44-0091. B, the half-acre with the stone structure, as part of a much larger original holding. In the 1891 County Atlas, the surrounding land was labeled with a single name, J. R. Calloway, 186 acres. Edna looked at the name for a long time. She asked Ruth to pull the Calloway deed records. They were considerable. Josiah Ruel Calloway had acquired his first parcel of land in Harlan County in 1883 at 31 years of age, with money that the deed of trust indicated came from the settlement of a Kentucky mining claim. He had added to his holdings systematically across the following decade, purchasing adjacent parcels from 4 different neighbors in transactions that Ruth following Edna's pointing finger across the plat maps, could trace precisely. By 1895, Josiah Calloway owned 186 acres of eastern Harlan County, the largest contiguous private holding in that part of the county at that time. He had built on it extensively. The county building assessments from 1896 and 1897 listed on his property a farmhouse, a large barn, a smokehouse, a springhouse, and listed separately, with a notation that struck Edna immediately, a stone strongroom, approximate 30 by 60 feet, limestone, below grade. Below grade. A root cellar. Or something more. She asked Ruth what had happened to the Calloway estate. Ruth produced the probate records. Josiah Calloway had died in January of 1911, at 59, of what the death certificate listed as pneumonia. His will, filed with the county probate court in February of that year, had been contested within 6 weeks of filing. 2 of his surviving children, a son named Warren and a daughter named Clara, disputed the division of the estate. The will left the farmhouse and the main acreage to Warren. It left the stone strongroom and the half-acre surrounding it, along with a specific list of contents described as instruments and securities held therein, to Clara. The probate dispute had taken 8 years. When it was resolved in 1919, the court had found in Warren's favor on the acreage, but had ordered that the half-acre parcel containing the stone structure be transferred to Clara's name as a separate legal parcel, the same parcel that now appeared in the county records as Harlan County Tax Parcel 44-091. B. Clara Calloway had died in 1923, unmarried, without issue. The parcel had passed through 3 subsequent owners across the 20th century, each holding it for a time, none developing it, until a farmer named Gene Riddle had erected the metal agricultural shed around the original stone structure in 1982. Riddle had died in 2001. His estate trust had dissolved without clear succession. The property had gone delinquent, year by year, until it appeared on a county tax auction list for the balance of $3. Edna sat at the light table with the plat maps and the deed records spread in front of her and worked through the arithmetic of what she was looking at. The will had specifically listed instruments and securities held therein in the stone strongroom. That was not the language of a man describing an empty root cellar. That was the language of a man who knew precisely what was inside a sealed room and intended to leave it to a specific person. The sealed section of the south wall. The key found in the gap between stone and metal. The mortar work dated to the late 1890s, years before Josiah's death, years before the probate dispute. He had sealed it himself. He had done it carefully, with dressed stone and good mortar, and he had left the key nearby, close enough to the structure that someone who knew where to look could find it. Clara had never found it, or had never been given the chance. The probate dispute had dragged 8 years, and Clara had died for years after it was resolved, and whatever she had known or not known about the sealed room and its contents had died with her. Edna drove back to the shed in the late afternoon with the photocopies Ruth and had made for her: the plat maps, the deed records, the probate filings, the building assessment notation, and spread them on the shelf beside the iron key. Howard read them in the order she had arranged them, without hurrying. When he finished, he sat on the edge of his cot with his hands clasped and looked at the sealed section of the south wall, which was visible from where he sat in the low evening light of the firebox. "Vera Calloway," he said. "Josiah's daughter," Edna said. "She never got to open it. The probate dragged until 1919. 8 years. And she died in 1923, for years after she legally owned the parcel." Howard was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she knew about the key?" Edna looked at the sealed wall. It was possible that Clara had known. It was possible she had spent those 8 years of probate dispute waiting to get to a room she knew the contents of, only to arrive when she was too old or too unwell or too worn down by the proceedings to act on it. It was equally possible she had never known the key existed, that Josiah had hidden it in the gap against the outer metal wall, but the metal shed had not been there in Josiah's time. He could not have hidden the key in the gap between metal and stone in 1895, because there was no metal and no gap. The key must have been placed there later, by someone else, at some point after 1982, when the metal shed went up around the stone structure. She said this to Howard. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "Gene Riddle." Edna looked at him. Gene Riddle built the metal shed in 1982. He lived on this land for 20 years. If he found the key, found it somewhere in or around the original stone structure when he was building and didn't know what it was for, or couldn't get into the sealed section himself, he might have kept it safe the only way he knew how. Put it in the gap between the metal and the stone where it wouldn't get lost. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also, Edna thought, the explanation of a man who had respected what he found without fully understanding it, and whose respect had preserved something across 20 years of the land changing hands and changing purposes and going slowly to delinquency. There was something that moved her about that. A man who did not know the history of what he was caretaking, keeping it safe anyway. She had spent 32 years in a library. She understood the value of careful stewardship over things whose full meaning you could not see. The following morning brought a complication they had not anticipated. Howard had been examining the flagstone floor below the sealed section, looking for evidence of the below-grade notation in the 1896 building assessment, which had implied the strong room was partly sunken into the ground. He found it not in the floor itself, but in a section of the east wall, roughly midway along its length, where the original limestone showed a faint horizontal joint running between two courses at about knee height. The joint was different from the other mortar courses, slightly wider, slightly more irregular, with a texture that suggested it had been disturbed and repointed at some point. He called Edna over. They examined it together. Howard used a thin probe to test the joint of wire he had bent into a hook for exactly this kind of inspection, and found that the probe, at one point, went further than it should have. A small gap, perhaps half an inch wide, running behind the face of the mortar. A cavity behind the east wall. They spent 2 days on it. Howard carefully probed the mortar at intervals across the full length of the east wall, mapping the extent of the cavity behind it. By the end of the second day, his measurements suggested a void space roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, located at the center of the east wall, behind perhaps 4 inches of dressed limestone facing. He sat back on his heels and looked at Edna. "There might be 2 sealed sections," he said. They removed the facing stone carefully over the course of a full day's work, Howard extracting the dressed limestone blocks one by one and setting them aside in order, Edna steadying each block as it came free. The cavity behind the facing was real. It was approximately the dimensions Howard had predicted, lined on 3 sides with the original rough limestone of the deeper wall. It was empty. Not entirely empty, there was a wooden shelf, long since warped and collapsed, and the rusted remnants of what appeared to have been several large tin canisters, their sides corroded through. Whatever they had held had been consumed by time and moisture seeping through the east wall, which faced the slope of the surrounding ground and had apparently never been as well sealed as the south wall section. Howard ran his hand along the collapsed shelf. The tin canisters had been sealed at some point, their lids visible in the rust. One of them, the largest, had a partial paper label still adhered to its side, the ink long since illegible, the paper gray and fragile as ash. They looked at the empty space for a long time. "This is not what Josiah sealed," Edna said. "No." Howard stood up, pressing his hands against his lower back. His arthritis was speaking to him today. "This is older. Predates the sealing work on the south wall by at least a decade, based on the mortar. This was ordinary storage that got filled and forgotten. The canister's food storage, probably. Lard. Grain. Something that didn't survive." He looked at the sealed south wall section, still intact, its smooth mortar joints faintly distinguishable in the shed's afternoon light. "That one," he said, "is still what it always was." They replaced the east wall-facing stones carefully, repointing the mortar with a lime mix Howard had prepared to match the original composition as closely as he could. It took most of an afternoon. When they finished, the east wall looked exactly as it had before they started. The iron key sat on the shelf where Edna had placed it beside her father's photograph. Howard cleaned it that evening, working with the careful attention he brought to every old piece of iron or steel: a light oil, a soft cloth, the gentle removal of the surface oxide without disturbing the metal beneath. The key, cleaned, was finer than it had appeared. The bit was well cut, for rectangular wards arranged in a pattern that Howard sketched in his notebook and then studied for a long time. He had rebuilt enough old lockwork to read a key's profile reasonably well. "Ward lock," he said. "Late 19th century, consistent with the building dates. The bit pattern is specific. This isn't a skeleton key. It's a key made for one particular lock." "And the lock is behind the wall," Edna said. "The lock is behind the wall," he agreed. He set the key down between them on the folding table they used for meals and looked at it. They had been on the property for 6 weeks. They had made the shed habitable. They had established water and heat. They had worked through the county records at 3 different archives and assembled a picture of what this building had been and who had sealed it and why. They had found an empty cavity that turned out to be old storage, which had cost them 2 days and produced nothing except the confirmation that the sealed south wall section was the anomaly Josiah Calloway had put his careful attention into. Howard's survey notes were meticulous. The sealed section was 8 feet wide and approximately 7 feet tall, built against the existing south wall with dressed limestone from a different quarry than the surrounding original construction. The floor below it showed a change in flag orientation, the herringbone pattern running perpendicular in that section, as though the floor had been relayed. The mortar was consistent with late 1890s construction. The key was consistent with a late 19th century warded lock mechanism. There was one remaining question before they opened it, and Howard had been turning it over for 3 days without speaking it aloud. He spoke it now. "The probate filing listed instruments and securities held therein," he said. "Josiah Calloway sealed this room and left the contents to Clara in his will. The probate dragged for 8 years. Clara died in 1923 without opening it, as far as we can determine. And in 1919, when the court awarded her the parcel, the contents were described in the court's own finding as contents unknown, as sealed." "Which means the court never opened it either," Edna said. "Which means whatever Josiah put in there in the late 1890s has not been touched since." The fire in the firebox settled with a small sound. Fig shifted on his warm limestone ledge without opening his eyes. Edna looked at the sealed section of the south wall. 8 feet wide, 7 feet tall. A different quarry, better dressed stone, more careful mortar. A key hidden in the metal skin of a shed that hadn't existed when the key was placed, but that someone, after 1982, had preserved in the only careful way available to them. 125 years, give or take, since anyone had stood on the other side of this wall. She picked up the key. She turned it in her fingers, feeling the weight and the fit of it, the specific heft of iron that had been made for one purpose and kept, across 3 generations of change and loss and administrative neglect and accidental preservation. For the moment, it would be used. "Tomorrow," Howard said. "We do it properly. Good light. The camera. Carl, if he can come, we need a witness." Edna set the key down on the shelf beside the probate filing and the plat maps and the copy of the building assessment that listed a stone strong room, approximate 30 by 60 feet, limestone, below grade. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She was not a woman who dramatized things. She had been a librarian. She understood that the most important things were often the most ordinary in the moment of their happening. The patron who found the book they needed, the record that answered the question, the document that connected one life to another across a distance of years. The importance of those moments was rarely felt in the moment itself. It came later, in the telling. She knew, in the particular way that people who work with records and history know things, that tomorrow would be one of those moments. The kind that looked unremarkable from the outside, an elderly woman and her husband standing in a rusted shed on half an acre of eastern Tennessee ground, turning a key in a wall, and that would, once it was done, change the shape of everything that came after. She was 71 years old, and she had lost nearly everything in the past 2 years. Tomorrow she was going to open a door. Carl arrived at 7 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and his good camera, the one he used for the grandchildren's school events. And he set both on the folding table without a word and looked at the sealed section of the south wall with the expression of a man who has agreed to witness something without fully understanding what it is. Howard handed him a cup. They drank in companionable silence while the firebox took the morning chill out of the air, and Fig moved from his sleeping spot to the patch of early sun now crossing the flagstone floor from the new south window. "You're sure about this?" Carl said. He was not asking whether they should proceed. He was asking whether Howard was physically ready, which was Carl's way of asking whether his brother's arthritis was going to be a problem today without making it a conversation about the arthritis. "I'm sure," Howard said. Edna had been awake since before dawn. She had made a careful record in the notebook she had been keeping since they arrived: dates, observations, measurements, the research findings from the county library, the probate records, the building assessment, and had written the morning's date at the top of a fresh page with the intention of recording what happened next in the same factual, unembellished way she had recorded everything else. She was a librarian. Documentation was how she made sense of the world. She picked up the iron key from the shelf. Howard had spent 2 careful hours the previous afternoon exposing the lock mechanism. He had worked from his surveying probe and a small mason's chisel, removing mortar from a specific section of the sealed wall's face, a section he had identified through close examination as the most likely location for the lock, based on the position of the wards in the key and the standard placement conventions of 19th-century warded locks in stone-built rural structures. His hands were not as precise as they had once been, but precision and patience are not the same thing, and Howard had patience in quantities that had never diminished. The lock was there. A plate of wrought iron set into the back face of the sealed section stone, the keyhole obscured by a thin course of mortar that had been applied over it, not sealed shut. Edna understood, but simply covered, the way you might cover a door handle with a cloth to keep the dust off. A covering, not a ceiling. Vera Calloway had intended this room to be opened. Howard fitted the key into the lock. It did not turn immediately. He did not force it. He held it steady for a moment, feeling for the resistance the way the wards caught, which of them were binding, and then he applied a slow, even pressure, turning slightly, releasing, turning again, feeling for the point where the mechanism gave. Carl was watching from 3 feet back, his camera raised. Edna was beside Howard, close enough to touch his arm if she needed to, which she did not. The lock turned, not with drama, with a measured, sequential give, each ward clearing in turn, the bolt drawing back in stages, the sound of a mechanism that had been well made and was still, after more than a century of stillness, functioning as designed. Howard felt the full rotation complete under his hand, and he held the key steady at the end of its travel. Then he stepped back and looked at the sealed section. There was no door in the conventional sense. The sealed section was a false wall, a panel of fitted limestone dressed to match the surrounding construction, and it did not swing on hinges. It sat in a channel, a groove cut into the floor flags, and the ceiling stones designed to slide laterally. Howard found the edge, a recessed grip on the right-hand side that revealed itself once he knew to look for it, and he pulled. The panel moved. Stiffly, the stone grinding against decades of mineral accumulation in the channel, but it moved. Howard pulled it a foot to the right, then 2 feet. Then Edna added her hands to the work, and together they moved it 3 full feet along its channel until enough of the opening was exposed to step through. The smell that came out was dry and mineral and old. Not unpleasant. The smell of enclosed limestone and time. The same smell as the rest of the building, but concentrated, pure, undiluted by the decades of weather and animal habitation that had processed the air on the other side of the wall. Howard shone his flashlight into the space. The vault was 8 feet wide, 4 feet deep and 7 feet tall, a room within a room, lined on 3 sides with the same rough limestone as the original structure. The ceiling formed by the same stone that formed the floor of the original above-grade construction. The floor was flagstone, a single course of large flat limestone pieces laid without mortar, the work of a man who understood drainage and wanted his floor to breathe. Along the back wall, wooden shelving. 3 shelves, built from heavy oak boards that had held their shape in the sealed, dry air. The wood darkened to the color of strong tea, but structurally sound. Howard pressed on the middle shelf with his palm. It did not flex. On the shelves, 2 items. The first was a strongbox. Iron, approximately 18 inches wide and 12 inches tall, with a latch mechanism and a padlock, the padlock not locked, the hasp left open, hanging from its ring as though Josiah had set it down for a moment and intended to come back. The box sat on the middle shelf with the patient heaviness of something that contains things of substance. The second was a leather portfolio, flat, tied closed with a cord that had once been brown and was now the color of old bones. It sat on the top shelf, above the strongbox, precisely centered. Carl took photographs. His camera made its small sound in the silence of the vault, recording what was there before any of it was touched. Howard lifted the strongbox from the shelf. He carried it to the folding table outside the vault and set it down. The weight was considerable. Edna untied the cord on the portfolio and carried it out in both hands. She set the portfolio on the table beside the strongbox, and the 3 of them stood around it for a moment. "Open the portfolio first," Carl said. This surprised Edna slightly. Carl was not usually a man who directed proceedings, but she understood immediately that he was right. The documents would tell them what they were looking at before they opened anything else. The cord came free without difficulty. The leather, though dark with age, was supple, had been treated with something, probably lanolin or tallow, before the room was sealed, and the sealed conditions had preserved the treatment across the decades. Edna opened the portfolio carefully, laying it flat on the table. Inside were documents. Paper, heavyweight, the kind used for legal instruments in the late 19th century, with the texture of cloth and the weight of intention. The top sheet was written in a clear, deliberate hand, the penmanship of someone who had been taught that how you wrote a thing communicated respect for it. Edna read it first silently, then aloud, in the way she had always read important documents twice, to be sure of what she was seeing. It was a deed of conveyance. Josiah Ruel Calloway, in his capacity as sole owner of 186 acres in Harlan County, Tennessee, conveying the full property, the farmhouse, the barn, the outbuildings, the strong room, and all appurtenant land to his daughter, Clara May Calloway, in fee simple absolute. Dated July 14, 1897. Signed by Josiah and notarized by the county clerk of court. And then, below the notary's seal, a second signature, a witness. The Reverend Thomas Birch of the First Methodist Church of Harlan County. Edna looked up from the document. "He filed the deed in here," she said. "He conveyed everything to Clara 14 years before he died. He never recorded it at the courthouse." She looked at the document again. "He had the conveyance made legal, witnessed, notarized, and then he sealed it in this room." Howard was reading over her shoulder. Why not record it? Edna thought about this. She thought about what she knew of Josiah Calloway from the county records, a careful man, a private man, a man who had built his holdings systematically and documented everything in the deed books and tax ledgers, but who had, apparently, made one significant legal act and then deliberately kept it from the public record. Below the conveyance deed were 3 more documents. A detailed inventory of the property as of 1897. A promissory note from a neighboring landowner acknowledging a debt to Josiah of $4,200, secured against 60 acres. And a letter, 2 pages, in the same clear hand as the deed. She read the letter to Howard and Carl, standing at the folding table in the morning light from the new south window, with Fig watching from his limestone ledge. Josiah had written it in 1897, the same year as the deed. He had written it to Clara. He had written it knowing, he said, that there were people who intended to contest his estate and that the courthouse records were not beyond the reach of men with enough money and motivation to cause problems. He had made his intentions regarding Clara's inheritance clear in his will, but a will required probate, and probate, in his experience and observation, was a process that favored those with money to spend on it and time to spending it. What he had done instead was create the legal transfer 14 years before his death and seal it in the most secure location on his property, together with the gold he had been accumulating since 1890 in preference to depositing it in banks he did not trust, together with the promissory note that represented a substantial debt owed to Clara's estate. He had told Clara the room existed and that the key would be at the property. He had not told her where, exactly, because he had not wanted her to retrieve the documents before his death. He wanted them to remain sealed, beyond the reach of the probate process. He wrote in the letter that he had hidden the key somewhere she would find it when she came to take possession of the parcel. She had not found it, and Josiah, for years after she finally received the parcel legally, had gone to his daughter's grave without knowing she had never opened the room. Edna read to the end of the letter. The last paragraph was brief. Josiah had written, "What is in this room is yours by law and by love both. I have put it beyond reach of those who would contest what is plainly right. Take it and use it, and do not let any man tell you it was luck or charity that brought it to you. It was always yours. I simply kept it safe until you could come for it." Carl had put the camera down. He stood at the folding table, and he did not say anything for a long time. He was not, by nature, an emotional man. He looked, Howard thought, the way a man looks when he has witnessed something he did not expect to find moving and has been moved anyway. They opened the strongbox. The padlock lifted free from the hasp easily, the mechanism unoiled but functional, the same quality of craftsmanship as the wall lock, iron made to last. Inside the box were cloth bags, 7 of them, each drawn tight with a cord. Howard lifted the first bag and set it on the table, and Edna loosened the cord. Gold coins. Double eagles, the American $20 gold piece, standard American coinage from the late 19th century, each coin just over an inch in diameter with the image of liberty on the obverse and the eagle on the reverse. Howard counted them out of the first bag onto the table, 7 coins. He opened the second bag. 7 more. He worked through all 7 bags. 47 coins in total, each one carrying the particular weight of gold, each one bearing a date between 1895 and 1908. They were not tarnished in the way of silver. Gold does not tarnish. They were the same color they had been when Josiah placed them in their cloth bags in the late first decade of the 20th century, each one bright and precise in the morning light, each one worth, at the melt value alone, something in the range of $2,000 at current gold prices. Howard picked up one coin and turned it in his hand. He did not have the expertise to assess collector value that would require a professional, but he knew gold when he held it, and he knew that 47 double eagles was not a small accumulation. Josiah Calloway had been saving deliberately across nearly 2 decades, placing coins one by one into this room that was never supposed to be opened by anyone except his daughter. Carl counted a second time, to be sure. 47. Edna sat down on her cot, which was the nearest surface. She did not cry. She had known, on some level, since the moment her palm had rested on the sealed section of the south wall in the first days of their arrival, that what was behind it was going to be real. She had not known the precise shape of it. She had not known about Josiah or Clara or the conveyance deed that had sat in a sealed room for 127 years waiting to be found by someone whose name, by the particular strange logic of the past, was also Calloway. Her maiden name, her mother's name, her grandmother's name. 3 generations of women named Calloway in Harlan County, Tennessee, none of whom had known that a room existed with documents in it that carried that name on a deed of conveyance dated 1897. He was family, she said. Howard looked at her. Josiah Calloway. Whatever the precise connection, great-great-uncle, second cousin twice removed, something in that line. He was family. And he sealed this room for Clara, and Clara never came. And the parcel went through 100 years of people who didn't know what they were sitting on, and it came to a county tax auction for $3. She paused. "And you found it?" "We found it," Howard said. Howard's contact at the county assessor's office connected them, the following week, with a numismatist from Lexington named David Park, who drove down on a Saturday with a loupe and a reference catalog and spent 4 hours examining each of the 47 coins individually. He assessed them in the focused, unhurried way of someone whose professional pleasure comes from exactly this kind of work. When he finished, he produced a handwritten appraisal. The 47 double eagles ranged in condition from MS 60 to MS 64 on the Sheldon scale mint state. Uncirculated or nearly so, consistent with coins that had been placed directly into cloth bags after acquisition and sealed in stable, dry conditions. The range of collector value per coin was between $2,800 and $3,400, depending on date and specific die variety. Total appraised value, $138,600, with a range up to $155,000 depending on which auction format was chosen. David Park shook their hands before he left and said, without elaborating, that in 30 years of this work he had never assessed coins found under exactly these circumstances, which was his way of saying the day had been unusual, and that unusual, in his experience, was almost always good. The legal situation required more time. Edna hired an attorney in Harlan County, a woman named Barbara Steele who practiced property law and had been recommended by Ruth and Combs at the library as the most thorough land attorney in the Eastern County. Barbara examined the conveyance deed and the supporting documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that what she was looking at was either straightforward or very complicated and was not yet sure which. It turned out to be both. The conveyance deed was legally valid. Notarized, witnessed, executed in 1897 by a competent grantor in full possession of his estate. The fact that it had never been recorded at the courthouse was irregular, but not fatal to its validity. Tennessee property law of the era did not require recording for a deed to be valid between the parties, only for it to have priority over subsequent purchasers. The chain of title in the county. Records showed that after the probate settlement in 1919, the main acreage had been sold off in parcels by Warren Calloway's heirs across the 1920s and 1930s. Several of those parcels had changed hands multiple times across the following decades. Barbara spent 6 weeks tracing the current ownership of the land that had originally been part of Josiah's 186 acres. She produced a title report that ran to 40 pages and that Edna read in its entirety over 2 evenings, marking points of interest with small adhesive tabs the way she had always marked important passages in reference books. On page 31 of the report, she found a name she recognized. Brentridge Development LLC, a Knoxville-based property development company, had acquired 62 acres of former Calloway land in 2 separate purchases in 2019 and 2021. The company held the parcels under development review, pending a county approval for a mixed residential and commercial project. The company was listed with the State Business Registry. Its principal members were listed by name. Douglas Brent was among them. Edna read the name twice. She set the report down on the table and looked at the flagstone floor of the shed, the herringbone floor that Josiah Calloway had laid, that Gene Riddle had driven equipment across for 20 years without knowing what it was, that she and Howard had scrubbed with vinegar and water in the first days and found beautiful beneath the grime. She did not feel anger. She considered this carefully, looking for anger, the way you check a room for something you thought you left there. She found instead something colder and more useful: clarity. Douglas Brent had spent 19 months dismantling her life and her marriage's financial security through a legal process he had specifically engineered. He had done it on land that was, by the terms of an 1897 conveyance deed that he could not have known existed, arguable. Barbara Steele filed a title claim on behalf of Edna Calloway Marsh. The claim created what Barbara described, with the precise understatement of a property attorney who is very confident of her position, as a cloud on the title of the 62 acres held by Brentridge Development LLC. A cloud on the title meant that the development approval Douglas had been seeking, a project Barbara's inquiry revealed to be valued at approximately $2.3 million, was effectively frozen. No county would approve development on land with an unresolved title dispute. Douglas called Edna on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the claim was filed. She was in the shed when her phone rang. She was sitting on her cot reading Josiah's letter again, which she had read perhaps 20 times by then, not because she needed to, but because she found it steadied something in her that had been unsteady for 2 years. She answered. Douglas's voice was carefully modulated in the way of a man who has spent 30 years conducting difficult conversations and understands that tone is a tool. He expressed surprise at the recent developments. He said he was sure there had been some misunderstanding regarding the title history. He said he believed that a cooperative approach between family members would serve everyone better than protracted legal proceedings. "We are not family members, Douglas," Edna said. There was a brief silence. Then he said, "You know what I mean." "I do," she said. "And I want you to know that I'm going to let Barbara handle this completely. If you have a proposal, please put it in writing and send it to her office." She ended the call. Patricia called the following day. The conversation was different from every conversation they had ever had, smaller, stripped of the managed quality Patricia usually maintained. She said she had not known about the development company. She said Douglas had told her the claim was a nuisance suit that would be dismissed. She said she was not calling to argue the legal situation. "Then what are you calling for?" Edna asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. Which was, in 40 years of sisterhood, the most honest thing she had said. Edna did not forgive her on that phone call, because forgiveness is not a thing that can be compressed into a single conversation, and anyone who has ever genuinely forgiven someone understands this. But she talked to her sister for 22 minutes, which was longer than any conversation they had had in 4 years, and when she hung up, she sat for a while in the quiet of the shed and let the day settle. Nora called a week later. She did not perform concern this time. She said, "Mom, I'm sorry for how I handled things." 6 words. She had clearly been working up to them, and Edna recognized the effort behind them, which costs something in a person who has convinced themselves for 2 years that they made the right choice. "I know," Edna said. She asked about the grandchildren. They talked for a while. It was not reconciliation. Reconciliation takes longer than a phone call and requires more from both parties than either of them had managed yet. But it was a beginning, the kind that arrives without announcement, in the middle of an ordinary week, when someone picks up the phone and says 6 honest words. The title dispute was settled 7 months after Barbara filed the claim. Douglas and his partners at Brent Ridge Development offered a negotiated settlement, $890,000, paid to Edna Calloway Marsh in full, in exchange for a release of the title claim. Barbara advised Edna that the claim, while strong, was not certain of prevailing at trial. Title disputes never are, and that the settlement amount represented a fair outcome given the uncertainty of litigation. Edna accepted. The coins were sold the following spring through a numismatic auction house in Nashville. The final realized price was $143,000. The total was $1,033,000, more or less, depending on how you counted the interest earned during the months of proceedings. It was more money than Edna had held at any point in her 72 years of living, and she sat with that knowledge for a few days without doing anything with it, which seemed like the appropriate response. Then she made a list. The debts that remained from the partition battle, the attorney's fees, the smaller obligations they had accumulated in the months of displacement, those were cleared first, in one transaction, without ceremony. A portion went to the Harlan County Public Library Endowment, restricted to the local history collection, in the name of Ida Calloway. Ruth and Combs sent a handwritten note that arrived on a Thursday, and that Edna read at the table in the shed with her coffee, and then folded carefully and put in the box with Josiah's letter. A scholarship at the County Community College, established in Vera Calloway's name, for women returning to education after a period away from it. Barbara Steele helped set up the paperwork. The first recipient, the following fall, was a woman of 43 who had spent 15 years managing her family's farm and was returning to study agricultural business management. And Howard built a house. Not a large house. They did not need a large house. He designed it himself, in the surveyor's shorthand he had always used for site plans, on graph paper at the folding table across several evenings, working with the particular focused pleasure of a man who has been given the material to do something he has always understood how to do. The house was 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with good light on the east side, a sitting room, and because Edna had asked for it specifically, a small reading room at the back, built against the original limestone south wall of the old structure. The sealed section of that wall was now the reading room's primary feature. The panel had been restored to its channel and could be slid open and closed again, and inside the vault cleaned now, the wooden shelving repaired, the floor flagstone scrubbed. Edna had placed a single archival box containing the original documents, Josiah's conveyance deed, his letter to Clara, the promissory note, the property inventory. A brass plate on the wall of the vault, small, read, J. R. Calloway, 1897. Clara May Calloway, 1911 to 1923. Edna Calloway Marsh, 2024. 3 names. 127 years between the first and the last. On the afternoon the house was finished enough to actually live in, which Howard defined as the afternoon. He installed the kitchen sink and turned on the water, and it ran without leaking. Carl drove out with his wife and a bottle of wine, and they sat on the unfinished porch in the late afternoon light and looked at what had been made from a $9 shed on a half-acre of eastern Tennessee ground. Howard was quiet in the way he was always quiet when he had finished something he was satisfied with. Carl talked about the birds visible at the edge of the clearing. Carl's wife talked about the garden. She could see Edna planting the turned earth along the south face of the limestone wall, already showing the first green of the herb seedlings. Edna had started in coffee cans on the windowsill in March. Fig sat on the warm limestone of the new porch step and watched a beetle with the focused attention of a cat who has everything he needs and is simply managing the afternoon. Edna had Josiah's letter on the table beside her chair. She did not take it out. She knew it well enough by now that she did not need to read it. She simply kept it close, the way you keep certain things close, not because you need to look at them, but because their proximity is itself a form of comfort. She thought about Clara, who had waited 8 years for the law to give her what her father had already given her, and who had died without knowing it was waiting 30 feet from where she stood. She thought about the key hidden in a 2-inch gap between an old stone wall and a metal shed that didn't exist until 20 years after Clara's death, preserved by the careful instinct of a man named Gene Riddle who had never known what he was preserving. She thought about Howard reading a county tax auction listing on a Thursday afternoon at Carl's kitchen table and finding something in a drainage notation that nobody else had looked for. She was 72 years old. She had lost her family's land, her house, her savings, and most of what she had believed about the reliability of the people who were supposed to love her. She had bought a rusted shed for $9 and moved into it with a cat and a retired surveyor and her mother's good china. She had spent 6 weeks making it survivable and 6 months making it hers. And in the process of doing those two things, she had opened a door that had been sealed for 127 years and found inside it the evidence that the land she came from had never stopped belonging to her family. Nobody had given her this. Nobody had orchestrated it. There was no anonymous benefactor, no hidden architect of her recovery. There was Howard, who read drainage notations the way other men read newspaper headlines. There was Ruth and Combs, who pulled deed books without being asked and spread them on the light table. There was Barbara Steele, who read 40 pages of title history and found a name on page 31. There was Josiah Calloway, dead since 1911, who had sealed a room with good mortar and left a key nearby and written a letter to a daughter who never came. And there was Edna herself, who had pressed her palm against a section of limestone on a cold March morning and felt something that she could not rationally justify, and had called her husband in from outside anyway. The clearing was full of afternoon light. The old cedar trees at the perimeter stood exactly as they had always stood. The limestone ridge at the south edge of the property caught the sun at the angle it had always caught it, turning the exposed stone a warm pale gold. The house was finished enough to live in. The door that had been sealed was open. Howard reached over and took her hand. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.